YouTube. And so just to really quick summarize, representing us today is for Senator Hettleman is Maura, for MDA, Rachel Jones, myself for the PSC, Diamond Wade on behalf of the Comptroller's Office, and Amanda on behalf of MDOT, Diego on behalf of MEA, Paul Perchinsky, Josh Cohen, and Matt Chen. All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mal.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, just a quick agenda. I think Ben gave a pretty good overview of what we're going to be speaking about today, but our hope is to do just brief 1-minute introductions to each of our companies. And then I have a bunch of information to present on both weights and measures and reliability data reporting regulations to learn from in California and some other states. And then I'll pass things on to Michael from ATE to dive into other states to consider and what other states have done on the different aspects of what this work group is looking at, hopefully with plenty of time for questions. So I'll pass things off to Michael Chen to get things started, or Matthew Chen, excuse me.
Thanks, Mel. I'm Matt from Blink Charging, based in Bowie, Maryland. We're an international EV charging company that both manufactures chargers and provides network software. I think briefly with business models, we provide what we would call a range of flexible business models, from owning and operating the station on one hand to direct sales, which has historically been very common in the level 2 sector, but owner-operator is becoming a lot more common quite recently. Additionally, we have what we would call hybrid owned, which we incur the cost of the charging equipment, and the property site host incurs the installation costs, and there's a portion of revenue sharing that occurs. There's also what we would call Blink as a service or a subscription program, where the host pays a monthly fee and keeps the charging revenues after deducting property network connectivity and processing costs. I think in addition, we have a new voluntary maintenance program called Blink Cares, and that allows folks who opt for the site host model to have kind of regular checks of the equipment and to make sure that they're serviced on a regular basis. So thank you, Bob.
Everybody, Caitlin Lee from EVgo. So EVgo is one of the nation's largest public fast charging networks, featuring over 1,000 fast charging locations across more than 35 states, including stations built through EVgo Extend, our white label service offering. But we're primarily our owner operator business model, which is where we develop, finance, install, own, and operate our fast charging network. We also take care of all our customer relationship needs with a 24/7 call center and support in multiple languages. We have a vested interest in ensuring stations are not only up and ready to serve customers, but also offer seamless customer experience. Network throughput is a large portion of the company's retail revenue, so a down charger is a missed revenue opportunity for us, as well as a negative customer experience. In early 2023, last year, we launched EVgo Renew, which is our comprehensive maintenance program created to bolster reliability and elevate the customer experience across our network. Through the Renew program, we conduct extensive vehicle interoperability testing at the EVgo Innovation Lab in El Segundo, California, and we perform preventative maintenance and health checks at fast charging stations, and we develop innovative technology solutions like AutoCharge Plus that streamline the charging experience for drivers. I've also included a picture of a station in Maryland that is one of our renewed stations and has a score of 10 on PlugShare. I'll pass it on to Josh.
Thanks. I'm with Switch, SWTCH. So a few key points about Switch as it relates to our business model and our approach to the market. Our focus, unlike EVgo as an example, is that we provide our solution to our end customer. So we provide our software, charging stations if they want it, but our business model is not one in which we seek to make revenue off of selling the electricity. So solutions provider rather than an owner operator. There is an asterisk there, which I'll get to. Our customer is not the driver. The driver we see as the end user. Our customer is the entity purchasing our charging equipment and services, which is typically the property owner or manager. In terms of our market niche, what we focus on, it's multi-tenant properties, especially residential apartments and condos, and happy to get more into that, but that's really our focus. Anywhere that there are multiple vehicles and often multiple users, that's our focus. And our core product as a company is the software platform. We don't manufacture. We partner with other hardware providers. I mean, we manufacture certain components, but in terms of the chargers themselves, we partner with leading companies that support the same open communication standards to operate on our network. And so depending on what our customers want, if they just want the software management platform on the back end, we can provide that. If they want full turnkey installation, maintenance, et cetera, we can provide that. Similar to some other companies, we also provide a switch care, which is optional. Our customer needs to pay for it, but that contractually commits switch to certain response times and uptime, minimum uptimes. The asterisk around our business model and switch not being an owner operator is that with a lot of incentives coming out that are, changing the economics more favorably for folks to deploy, own, and operate, we are starting to consider that. But we do see that as a more risky business proposition. So again, our core approach is to sell to a customer, but we are likely going to start dipping our toes in the owner-operator model. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. This is Anthony Willingham from Electrify America. I'll acknowledge there's some formatting issues here. Ben, I will send you a version of these slides that are cleaned up and polished and look as they're supposed to. Okay, everybody. Hi, I'm Anthony Willingham, Electrify America again. Our business model, we are primarily owner-operators of fast chargers. That is our bread and butter, with small but substantial, or smaller in relation, commercial operations. But with respect to our owner-operated stations, if you see an Electrify America station out in the wild, that station is owned, operated, maintained, financed by Electrify America. We set the cost to charge or for the charging services and retain that revenue. So similar to other owner-operators out there, our vested interest is in keeping stations up and running and in a state of good repair, because downstation not only jeopardizes that, frankly, revenue stream, but also goes against our larger mission, which is to increase electric vehicle infrastructure across the country and to encourage adoption of EVs. Next slide, I'll talk just a little bit about our commercial operations. We do have like I said, in relation to our larger operations, small but substantial nevertheless, commercial relationships with mostly public entities like cities or utilities. The biggest examples of that are our relationship with the state of New York, NYPA, and its Evolve EV program, and with some utilities like Rocky Mountain Power. In those instances, we operate primarily as vendors. So if you see a station that is branded Evolve New York, NYPA, or Rocky Mountain Power, the relationship there is they own the station, they set the cost to charge and retain the revenue. We, on the other hand, and they finance the construction of the station. We, on the other hand, are responsible for operating and maintaining it as the owner of the station wants and finances. So yeah, that's Electrify America's business model.
And I am Michael Krauthammer. I'm representing the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. We were established in 2017. We are a 501c6 organization. We take a big tent approach to membership. Our members include electric utilities, EVSE manufacturers, charging networks, truck and car manufacturers, many of the stakeholders in this work group, as a matter of fact, and in Maryland are members, including Exelon and First Energy. Our priorities are very broad and pretty straightforward. More EV infrastructure, We focus on state policies, not federal. We're active in states all across the country. We have been for many years. That is our sole focus. We emphasize a strong role for electric utilities, recognizing that they are an important stakeholder in the early development of deploying infrastructure, but there are roles for all of the stakeholders, including everyone on this call, of course. Like I said, big tent approach, and a very important principle that we advocate for here and elsewhere is open standards and interoperability, which are topics that are included within the purview of this work group, and we'll address those when the time comes. Thanks very much.
Thanks. And that just leaves ChargePoint. ChargePoint manufactures and designs level 2 and DC fast charging hardware and software to serve every charging use case. Our primary business model is to design the smart charging solutions and then sell them directly to an entity that will act as the owner operator of the station. So our direct customers include retail areas, convenience stores, multifamily properties, workplaces, fleets, and utilities as well. So Potomac Edison in Maryland is one of our customers for their utility owned and operated chargers. While ChargePoint does offer both installation and maintenance services as an offering, depending on what our customers need, different businesses may choose to go with their own providers for installation, as well as choose to self-maintain or find other services that they want to use for operation and maintenance. But really, our bread and butter is just making it easy for a variety of different properties to install charging in a way that makes sense for their unique business case. And I'll dive right into our information here. So I think one thing to highlight with the presentation of all these industry folks and our peers is that there are many different business models in the EVSE industry. And you might think of EVSE companies as one block that serve one role, which is interacting with the driver, but different companies are going to have different combinations of these roles. So for example, ChargePoint is an equipment manufacturer and a network operator, but we don't own and operate the stations. That would be our customers. You've heard from some other folks that serve different variation of these roles, and sometimes, depending on the customer, we'll have different roles. So maybe in some cases, a company is a station owner operator. In other cases, they might leave that to a specific site host. And so there is a lot of variety in terms of how different companies fit into these roles, as well as a lot of diversity within the subset of station owners specifically. So a station owner can be an EVSE company, a traditional fuel retailer, but it can also be companies that don't think of themselves primarily as fuel providers. So a grocery store, a hotel, a multifamily property, all of these entities can act as site hosts of charging stations, where the goal is to serve charging as an amenity for the people that go to that place. So guests, employees, residents, which means that there is a wide variety of stakeholders across all of these different functions to provide EV charging services to the end user, which is the driver. So with that in mind, I think it would be really helpful to dive right into what other states are doing, primarily California. And I want to focus on California because it's really the only state that has set a statewide policy on uptime and reliability. And so folks might be familiar with the draft Energy Commission regulations that came out earlier this year and are still yet to be final. The timeline is looking like at the earliest, regulations could be set January 1st of 2025, which means that the implementation and rollout really will be into the middle of next year before we start to see the outcome of these new rules. And the goal of them is to assess reliability on a statewide basis. That scope is going to focus on publicly funded chargers, so chargers that have received either state or ratepayer dollars and have been installed after January 1st, 2024. So it is non-retroactive. It is a data reporting exercise that is going to focus on stations on a go-forward basis. And the requirements for data sharing especially or focus on the network operator. So these regulations don't set any expectations for the station owner operator. It is simply a way to transfer information about how stations are performing from the network to the state. And that information is going to be published on a biannual or once every 2 years basis, with the first report coming out in 2025. And again, the goal here is to understand and track the reliability of the network. So at this point, the rules don't establish penalties for stations that don't meet the uptime and successful charge attempt rate requirements that are set in the draft regulation, but that could change over time as well. Now, I want to draw a line between the data reporting requirements that are going to be coming from the Energy Commission with the role of weights and measures, which is a function that is typically under Department of Agriculture. It's done so like that in California and in Maryland as well. And we see a lot of overlap between the two pieces, or how states operate. So I know a few weeks ago, the Maryland Department of Agriculture provided a really good background on weights and measures, but the key function of that work is consumer protection and primarily station accuracy. So can a station accurately report the energy that was dispensed to a consumer? Stations are expected to be registered, be metrologically accurate, and meet Handbook 44 guidelines. Importantly, the procedures that are outlined in Handbook 44 are not designed to check for reliability. They are designed to make sure that a meter is accurate. And so on the screen there is a photo of one of these testing devices attached to a charge point station with a test in process. And so through this process, it's possible that while inspectors are going out and checking conformance with Handbook 44 and other weights and measures regulations that are on the books, an officer might encounter a broken station and be an extra set of eyes to flag issues for the site host or station owner. Because these inspectors are actually initiating a session to be able to make sure that equipment is meeting the specifications that are outlined in Handbook 44, they can catch things that are more challenging to a remote network operator like ChargePoint to see remotely. So for example, a broken screen or a cut cable is not something that we can currently track. There are no sensors to be able to tell when those things happen, but there is this component of going out and seeing how stations are actually functioning in the field. That being said, ChargePoint has seen some challenges on the administrative side in rolling out weights and measures rules that we think is important to keep in mind as we're considering how to set a course for Maryland. And this is an area of active policy development where we started to see issues over the last 9 or 10 months or so. And so on the screen here, you see kind of a flow chart of how a typical kind of enforcement process goes from the perspective of what we've seen in California. And I've starred some of these steps that are creating issues for implementation. The first star there is when a device is tagged. So as a device manufacturer, ChargePoint is very aware of the specifications that our hardware has to meet in order to be used for a commercial purpose in the US, so states that adopt Handbook 44. But in our experience, tagging has mostly been related to process or administrative failures, not necessarily failures of station accuracy. So what that means is a site host or a station owner hasn't correctly registered the device. A registered service agent who's supposed to officially place the device in service hasn't done so correctly or per the county's requirements. And so we've had some challenges there. And it's really a testament to the diverse nature of station own and operators, which is what's creating a challenge. Like I said, a lot of station owners don't necessarily think of themselves as fuel providers, aren't aware of some of these requirements. And so there's been a lack of education and making sure that folks understand the process to kind of correctly put their device into service. A second challenge is that, and where you see the second star there, is about actually using the test device of the photo that I showed you on the previous screen to put a charger into service. The equipment that I showed is extremely expensive. It's hard to acquire. And so it adds significant cost and time to add that to the process. Because registered service agents that are supposed to be using these devices to put them out in the field aren't aware of them. In many cases, a registered service agent is a licensed electrician or a qualified service person who maybe has been working on charging stations for 10 or 15 years. And there simply hasn't been a connection made between the requirements that they're supposed to meet in order to comply with these regulations and the work that they do on the ground in the field to put devices into service. And so in California, we've seen just a general lack of education and awareness, which has led to a lot of stations being tagged and taken out of service for reasons other than an issue with the device's usability. And so we're seeing states starting to take a more stepwise approach to make sure that the weights and measures regulations don't present a barrier to deployment that slows down station installs and repairs. Ultimately, our goal is to make sure that consumers feel confident in what they're buying, and to that regard, the work of Department of Agriculture to implement weights and measures regulations are really important. But we also want to be conscious of adding additional costs or barriers to installing and repairing stations because we have seen it start to become a bottleneck in California. And we're hoping to address those issues. A couple of examples of states that are taking a more step-by-step approach include Michigan and Vermont. So they have rules and regulations on the books related to weights and measures. They've acquired testing equipment within the state and are starting to train enforcement officials. And they're going through the process of easing into these requirements by starting to get registered service agents registered so that there is a pipeline of folks to do this work and that they're aware of the requirements. And also just doing general education to make sure that station owner operators know what's expected of them as implementation of these things ramp up. There's still kind of a lot of partnership that has to happen to make sure that we balance the need for accurate devices and also to get stations registered and kind of build this process up. But we're really hoping that more states, including Maryland, take a collaborative approach to this so that the industry is not overwhelmed and so that there's a real pathway for compliance here. And so I know I'm kind of coming close to the end here, but I'm hoping that this slide provides a good overview of the difference between what we're seeing in California for reliability data reporting and then the weights and measures implementation. So as you can see, there are different state agencies responsible for implementing these rules. They have different levels of applicability. So reliability data reporting is only on a subset of chargers that are publicly funded after a certain date, while as weights and measures regulations have a broader scope of all chargers that are used for a commercial purpose. The subject of these regulations is different, so reliability data reporting is something that is the responsibility of a charging network, whereas it's up to station owners to make sure that they're complying with weights and measures requirements for registration and RSAs and those kinds of requirements. And so I think that the takeaway for this slide is that while there's overlap in topic areas between these two things, we're seeing states really firmly draw a line between how they're implemented and what the applicability, excuse me, what the applicability of these regulations are going to be. And then finally, as a takeaway here, Again, assessing accuracy is really distinct from assessing reliability, and we want to make sure that the scope, focus, and role of those kinds of regulations are within kind of the existing umbrella of what the Department of Agriculture already does, and ideally have some sort of state funding agency focus on data reporting if this working group decides to make a recommendation in that regard. We're hoping for grace with enforcement and compliance. We want to avoid any kind of penalties that'll avoid or discourage investment in charging stations. Because while this is an industry that has thousands of devices already deployed, it still is quite nascent. And so there's a lot of education and learning that has to be done as these new requirements ramp up. And then finally, there's no need to recreate the wheel for data reporting. To the extent that the state is interested in getting more information about the reliability of chargers in Maryland, we think it's important to align with the work that's already been done by California and avoid a state-by-state patchwork where there are different definitions for uptime, different ways of reporting that information, and also different scopes, which make it confusing and increase the cost of compliance for reporting entities. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, but I will pass things off to Michael.
Mal, thank you very much. So the intent of the 2 slides that I'm going to present today is to respond to questions posed since the previous call, primarily about like what other states are doing along the lines of what this work group is tasked with. So to the extent there's activity in states other than California, which Mal did a terrific job summarizing, what we're seeing is that the effort has revolved around taxes primarily, rather than reliability. And to be clear, that is not something we are advocating for. We believe taxes on EV charging energy would be inconsistent with the efforts of the state to promote EVs and EVSE. But like I said, we wanted to be responsive because we were asked about how regulations are emerging elsewhere. And so what you'll see here is I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 states, all at various stages of developing regulations. I listed next to each state the agency that is charged with the responsibility of carrying out the regulation. Georgia, let me just run through a couple of highlights on each of them. Georgia has a lot of registration and labeling information, including posting like information at the site in a prominent manner. They have a sales tax, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on sales tax, although it is kind of interesting, since this is a pretty wonky group on the call today. They're not doing it on a per kilowatt hour basis directly, but they have a formula for making an equivalent between gasoline and kilowatt hours. But the important takeaway from Georgia is that they have already had to pass a law delaying implementation of a recently passed law that would implement this taxing regime, because they have discovered very quickly that it's a lot more complicated than they anticipated, and they're nowhere near, they appear to be ready to enforce the regulations. And so there's a law now that's delaying implementation until 2026 at the earliest. They also take a pretty strident approach. Mal described a few minutes ago, and we also heard from Weights and Measures the other week, this process of how an EVSE can be condemned. In Georgia, according to the statute, the owner of the charger must appear in court within 3 to 10 days after the condemnation is issued, and the inspector makes a statement to the court. If it's not corrected, the EVSE can be confiscated, dismantled, and sold. So it's a pretty strong approach they take. In Iowa, also we see so they have basically a self-reporting mechanism for folks who have chargers for their own commercial vehicles. Residential are excluded. And then people who are in the business of providing charging for others also have to report and pay taxes on their kilowatt hours. Kentucky, only for public chargers of 20 kilowatts and above. Oklahoma, Also, only public charging, but only if there's a price on the electricity and only if it's 50 kilowatts and above, excluding workplace and multifamily. There was a lot of talk on our previous calls within this work group about like who to include. So you're seeing already a lot of variability across the different states as to who's covered and who's not covered, and how fees are remitted and whatnot. Oklahoma also does require a lot of detailed information to be provided to the state. They also have a special section that details how customer complaints are to be handled with charging. That's something that we are not seeing in the other states studied on this slide. Annual reporting. Notably, Oklahoma has a staggered effective date. So any charger installed prior to 2021 is grandfathered until 2041. And we see variations on this in other states. That is a position that we do support, having a grandfathering period and a long ramp for covering chargers. Texas has a set of regulations. They're going to be published in the Texas Register later this week or early next week, and they list what their proposed registration and fee schedule will be. Next slide, please. So another thing that we did, and when I say we, I'm referring to ATE, not necessarily everyone else on this call today. Not to say there's inconsistency, but we just haven't had time to sort of socialize all of these different items. So what we at ATE did is we took each of the different items that are listed in the statute that stands up this work group, and we broke them down into different categories with the understanding that the report is due to the General Assembly in November. There's a lot here. There's like almost 20 issues. There are states that have taken like one or two of these issues and spent years on them. And so, we recommend an incremental approach. We believe that the items in the green box are appropriate for this group to make a recommendation of some sort to the General Assembly, either by saying that they're not jurisdictional at all, they shouldn't be regulated, or looking to another jurisdiction somewhere else and basically adopting what they're doing, like with payment options, for example. And then the yellow and the red are sort of self-explanatory. They're more complicated, a lot of detail. The business is still emerging, hard to know exactly what to do with each of them. No time between now and November to really come up with any definitive recommendations even on those. I mean, I'd say it's almost hard to know like what the multiple recommendations would be. They're all so complicated and so deep. Two issues, the high level we'd think about are to make this distinction between reliability and weights and measures, and then also like which chargers do each regulation apply to. In conclusion, as Mal mentioned, like I said, it's important to separate reliability from weights and measures. We understand the emphasis here is on reliability. To the extent reliability is the focus of the work group, ATE's recommendation is for Maryland to take an incremental and light touch approach. And thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak today.
I'm not sure how much time we have left on the agenda, but to the extent that folks have questions for us, we'd be happy to answer them. So Ben, do you want to kind of MC at this point?
Yes, definitely keep your PowerPoint up in case we want to go back. Yeah, we have, I'm going to say 10 minutes. We can stretch that to 15 for the group if you have good discussion. I really do want to hit the, well, Michael just categorized the long bullet point list of things that I want to talk through. And so I want to make sure we have time for that. So but yeah, definitely don't want to cut this short. So the thing I will cut short is the review of the draft to straw man, because frankly, what was just discussed now may influence where you all want to go with that. So I'll just kick off with a couple questions and then raise your hand, members, or speak up. So going first to Mal on California, you were discussing basically using California as, if we, let's say on reliability, go to more of a reporting framework, or that's probably what that would lead to is reporting. You would say, look at California for what they're doing so we don't have this, I guess, mess of state by state reporting, which could make it harder on the various businesses if we do that. Historically, I've heard of NEVI as being the standard. So I guess my question for you is, one, how different is California from NEVI? And also our guidance from the legislature was look to NEVI. How different, I guess, is California from NEVI? And do you find it to be better than the NEVI reporting? Or I guess, would your recommendation change if we were to focus on NEVI instead of California? Obviously knowing what California is doing, but curious about that.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that question. There is a lot of overlap between what NEVI is doing and what California is doing. I would say both processes are in the implementation phase, or I guess NEVI is in the implementation phase and California is still kind of building the blocks to get to data reporting. And so our goal is really to make sure that there's not different sets of tools or requirements to actually transfer any data that's needed to be shared or kind of add to those frameworks. So I think that there's a lot of overlap, and NEVI, I think, is a good place to base on for Maryland as well. I focused on California in the discussion simply because NEVI is a federal program, and California is the first state that's done this on a state basis. But to the extent that NEVI is further along, it could maybe serve as a good example or baseline as well.
And I would just reiterate that for everybody to keep in mind that NEVI is a program that provides 80% funding for pretty expensive chargers. And so naturally, or perhaps not unreasonably, there are some strings attached. To the extent chargers do not receive public funding, it's a policy question as to whether that level of scrutiny would apply.
Right, and I think that will be something that's actually in the draft 2 questions for the members to think about. And I was actually kind of coming to my next question for you, Michael. So if you could flip back to the slide that walked through the state policies. Similar, I know California's uptime reliability standard is based off, did you receive state money through their version of MEA? For these, I guess Oklahoma, Texas, maybe Georgia, they all have reporting requirements. Are those also, do you know if those are tied to state funding or if those are more universal to all chargers in the state?
None of them are tied to state funding. They're all tied to just simply tax collection.
Tax collection, okay.
Yeah. Now there is one state, I forget exactly which one, but there is one state which requires charger operators to report to the state within a certain number of days if a charger is out of service for more than a certain number of days. That's a little bit of an outlier. That is a little bit of an outlier, though, and it's not clear, how that information is actually used.
Okay. And the reporting for the tax purposes, is that mostly making sure that they're telling this, like they're saying, here's how much energy flowed through our unit this year, so therefore this is how much you should be billing us for tax purposes? Is that what that reporting is really built up around?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in sales tax, so I don't know. Yeah. I think that the way it works, typically, I mean, there are people on the call who are tax collectors, so they're probably better to answer that question. But I think that the way it works is the charger, someone reports how many kilowatt hours were dispensed. That's then multiplied by the cents per kilowatt hour, and that's the amount that's remitted to the state.
Maybe let me reword the question. Are any of these really tied to reliability up? You said they were for tax purposes, so they're not really getting into like this 97% or other reliability.
No, that is not
right?
Reliability is not correct. Not an issue.
Yeah.
It's simply how many kilowatt hours and how many cents per kilowatt hour for taxes.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Other members.
Hi, this is Amanda from MDOT. I have a question for, I think, Michael. Based on this slide and this following slide, And knowing that Mal pointed out that California's program is not retroactive to apply to existing chargers, does AT have a recommendation either based on, well, potentially based on what you've seen in other states, like the ones shown on the screen now, for how Maryland could approach the existing chargers that would need to be registered for any regulations that we adopt, and like the time frame for that?
Yeah. Well, the idea of grandfathering is really important. What we don't want to do is impose regulations that would result in the removal of chargers that are perfectly functional. So, I mean, at a high level, that would be our recommendation. And we certainly, after this call, we can go into a lot more detail, obviously, on that. I don't know if does that satisfy the question for the limited purposes of this, this period. I don't want to overextend our time.
Sure, that's fine. If there's follow-up, that could be useful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Mike, if there's anything where any of you in responding want to give us more flushed out stuff, I can circulate it. We can circulate that to all the members. So if you're like here in writing, here's something that's a bit more detailed.
Well, I would say, just to elaborate then a little bit, with regard to like Handbook 44, for example, there are already dates in Handbook 44 that account for chargers, AC versus DC, and the date that they're placed in service, and when they have to comply with the accuracy and tolerance requirements of Handbook 44. So that's, Maryland can choose to be more lenient if Maryland chooses to change the date from Handbook 44 as published by NCWM. That's certainly within the state's right to do. As we see in Oklahoma, their grandfathering states for 20 years, chargers for 20 years, because they just they heard from industry that there's a lot of chargers out there that are working perfectly fine. And there's a lot of mechanical or process that needs to be addressed when determining like whether, when a charger was actually installed, which is often not known. And then like if a charger is repaired, to what extent does a repair constitute a new charger? So there's a lot of detail that gets into that. But the incremental approach is our overarching recommendation.
Right. Well, thank you, Michael. I saw Paul raise his hand.
Good afternoon, all. Ben, the questions that you asked were exactly the same ones I was going to ask. However, this conversation has basically evolved, I think, to meter accuracy and taxing. I mean, the big question is and always has been reliability. And I'd like to kind of bring that conversation back, because it seems that with the exception of maybe NEVI, reliability is not something that states are tackling. And I'd be interested in Michael's observation on that, as to what he thinks might be the answer to that. I mean, people have done independent surveys, and we're seeing something like only 75% of quote unquote public chargers showing reliability. Someone goes to one, it's supposed to be working, it's not working. What do you see as a potential answer to that? I mean, people have said here that we have basically, it's in our own best interest to make sure that our EVSEs are up and running. But we don't see that happening. So why not?
So I think the main reason I would say is that, like we've discussed before, if the chargers are deployed by a private company, I think many states see it as the company's business to ensure that its chargers are up and running. I'd like to ask Anthony and Caitlin, maybe if you all have, I think they'd be in an excellent position to answer this question based on what their companies are doing right now and what they're experiencing that is a direct outcome of the question you're asking, Paul?
Yeah, I'll
You know,
jump in
yeah.
here.
Go ahead, Anthony. Thanks.
This is Anthony Willingham at Electrify America. One of the biggest contributors to our reliability challenges are simply the fact that we've been putting fast chargers in the ground since 2018, and some of those chargers, that actual hardware from 2018, is still out there in the wild. So a lot of our challenges are related to aging equipment being, say, stressed beyond what back in 2018 they ever anticipating, by a demand that they never really anticipated ever having to service. To put that in perspective, there are some chargers from 2018 that are charging in a week what they charged in a year back in the day. So our biggest strategy right now towards addressing reliability is first, we affectionately call it rip and replace, ripping out that old stressed hardware and replacing it with 2024's best models, so that those chargers are built and ready to meet 2024's demand for charging. And also just general upgrades of our existing infrastructure, our existing stations, not just the rip and replace of old hardware for new hardware, but also expanding capacity at stations, adding additional chargers to stations so that more vehicles can charge simultaneously, and increasing the charging speeds at these stations so that not only can more vehicles charge there at newer hardware, but also at faster speeds so that turnover is happening, so you could service more vehicles within the same period of time. So yeah, it's aging infrastructure and the skyrocketing of demand at stations is kind of a great problem to have, but also not a good one when it's stressing old hardware. So our focus now is to replace that old stuff with new hardware.
Okay, so from what I'm hearing from you, appears to be, yeah, we've got some old EVSEs out there, and that we should really consider some kind of phase-in for reliability based on the fact that these are older EVSEs. And I'm not necessarily against that. I'm more concerned about the consumer experience, and it's not been good with the exception of the Tesla network. So I'd be willing to consider what you're talking about, but I think there needs to be some kind of date certain when reliability is expected, even on the older EVSEs.
Paul, one of the reasons that we talk about this incremental approach is that, like Anthony's talking about chargers from 2018. I mean, when I started installing chargers in Maryland, it was like 2013. I think a couple of those might actually, I'm not sure if any of them are still out there, but they might be. There was one supplier of chargers at that time. And even by 2015, there was like 2 suppliers of chargers. The growth in demand for DC chargers has so far exceeded the ability of qualified suppliers to keep up. Now it is catching up. And the folks on this call have been like the leaders in the space of designing and deploying chargers. But it wasn't that long ago that companies were testing out a couple different manufacturers and seeing which ones work. It took a little bit of time to get those out into the field to see how they're performing. Some of them had to be replaced really quickly because it was discovered that they weren't performing all that well. There's a little bit of residual hangover from that period that is still, I believe, showing up in the studies that we're seeing. And like Anthony said, there's robust efforts to replace the chargers with newer and better hardware that's able to stand up to the demands that we're putting on the chargers today, that's going to take time not only to deploy because there's a lot of infrastructure, but also for it to show up in people's real world experiences. When studies are done, many of which are based on customers' recall, what we're seeing is that experiences someone might remember from the past that's not reflective of what's happening today. So I really do believe that we're in a period where the network operators are deploying better hardware, workers are undergoing better training, responsiveness is improving, technology is improving so that our situational awareness of chargers is increasing, and the service technician networks are also being built out so that trucks can be rolled more quickly. So we're in a period where there's a lot going on a lot of different operational vectors to ensure that chargers are operating well. And a little bit, but we're not quite there, but we're all on the path to getting there pretty quickly, I would say. I hope that some of these examples that we've shared have been illustrative to understand like what's going on behind the scenes to keep chargers up and running reliably.
Yeah, I think this is all helpful. Thank you.
And if I could just elaborate a little further on some other efforts that the industry is doing to address the root causes of reliability and where we might see some organic improvement in reliability. And some of that is the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation has the National Charging Experience Consortium, which is the ChargeX Consortium. This is a work group that, for one example, is working on standardizing error codes, which will help with faster diagnosis of issues. The Society of Automotive Engineers, SAE, International Standards Organization, also has various committees working with, for example, the NACS connector and making sure those connectors are safe and reliable. There's also the Charging Interface Initiative, which is called CHAR-IN, which also has an interoperability task force that will help, make the handshake between chargers and vehicles more seamless. So those are some of the greater work that's happening in the industry.
Thank you. Paul, are you good?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much for the conversation.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to go to Matt next. Is there any other member besides Matt? Because then I will need to move to our next. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
And I think just adding to what Caitlin and others have said and Michael about payment standards, it's important to acknowledge the role that the NEVI program is playing in setting the baseline here. And California actually had rolled back their requirement for contact credit card readers with an EMV chip requirement. And that was, a failure point in a lot of cases for folks who either had older equipment and the reader was exposed to the elements. And now with the NEVI program setting contactless as the minimum standard going forward, California actually has aligned their program and are working that through the CEC now. And we expect that that will represent a customer service improvement because the communication failures that can occur with the contact card reader will, in part be resolved by having the more robust, reliable technology that's contactless and it's just a tap to pay, increasingly common industry standard.
Thank you, Matt. Any other member? We do need to move on, but need to make sure. Make sure you got your questions answered. All right. If any of the other members do have questions for this group, I think we can set up an opportunity for you to reach out and send them questions, and we can get that back to the members. This is not one and done by any means. Also, Mal, are you okay if I'm planning to post this on our PC62 site for others. So are you okay if I share this?
Yeah, absolutely. And to the extent that members have questions that they'd like to circulate amongst the industry, please feel free. We want to continue to be engaged in this conversation and appreciate the space.
Thank you. All right. So the next item I'm going to go through pretty quickly so we can move into the long list. So members, I will be circulating after this meeting a draft 2 framework. So this, what am I thinking here? This framework is the same one you've been looking at in Excel, but more fleshed out in writing. And it's trying to capture a number of the discussions that we've had and trying to also capture questions that have come up that have either been answered or still need to be answered. So I will be circulating this to you all for your thoughts and feedback on how to edit the framework further and also to answer some questions to help guide it. So just a quick walkthrough of it. Obviously just summary stuff. I do include a short survey of what is happening in the Maryland EVSE landscape. This will need to be fleshed out more for our final report, but there were questions about how many vehicles and charging stations are out there. And so I took that from MDOT's latest dashboard from July in terms of number of stations and ports. And also I made sure to highlight how many of these were supported by the network companies, which a number of them were here today, versus those who are not networked. So basically you have to go find the individuals who operate those to actually get them to register their devices with the state. Also, I think it's important to think about long-term projections. I have reached out to the Department of the Environment to see if they can give us a thought, let us know what their latest climate plan estimated in terms of number of electric vehicles, and if there was any consideration for the number of chargers that should be associated with that. MDOT, I did take comments that you filed with us a couple months ago that discussed the possible number of ports that would be needed to support the 1.3 million light duty vehicles in the state. So I've included those projections. Obviously, if you have better ones, please provide them or MEA. I saw Amanda raised her thumb, so that's good to see. But yeah, so that's just starting out numbers for the members to flick through. The next section, the uptime reliability, that's highlighting what us, the PSC, have done and what MDOT has done in that area. Very high level. We're going to dive into that more next. And then also just capturing that meter accuracy is captured already by law under weights and measures. And so at that point, we hit the straw framework, which is basically summarizing what we're overseeing, which is uptime reliability, and then also accuracy, and then discussing our goals. I do think, and actually Michael said this as well, there are two crux decisions that we do need to be making in the short term, because it's going to really influence where we go as a group, which is, first off, are we separating out uptime reliability and accuracy as a group? Are we addressing one, both of those? I've now established this framework such that I discussed the two separately, and for any sort of recommendations that we come, and you'll notice that throughout the straw man. And then second, yes, I think as we've seen in our previous meetings, a number of you are thinking, hey, if we are going to oversee this with a framework, we might need to consider different, only including some, or maybe or more likely we would include all, but we'd have different tiers of enforcement. And so to start, we need to, if we're going to distinguish between these types of chargers, it would be good for us all to start kind of deciding which ones that we want to treat with a more heavy hand versus lighter hand, or include. And so that's something as well as you work through this straw man, I would ask you all to think about. So then after that, this document's really just capturing what we've been discussing. So who is subject to the framework? I've captured where we all left off last time, and I've basically put those in italics throughout the document, where it's a straw man for you all to work with and change, and also includes questions for you all to answer as well. And so that's really what you're going to see through this document as you go through it, which would also include registration, data reporting and tracking, enforcement, and under enforcement, importantly, what I've tried to do is break it into different questions for you to try and answer, such as, should all EVSE be subject to some sort of negative penalty if they don't meet certain standards, versus should these really be more reporting and or notice violations. And so I try to capture that through these questions, and I'll obviously add something for you to draft your own view that we can socialize. And then administration, that we don't really need to go into that today. That's budgets that we've already asked the state agencies to work on. I will say one thing: it would be good for us in the short run if we were able to, by next meeting, determine if we were going to just keep the meter accuracy and Handbook 44 rules exclusively under MDA weights and measures, which means that all of us agencies don't need to think about trying to incorporate those rules. We only need to, for budget reasons, think about the uptime reliability standards. Once again, a lot of these budgets might be influenced by which chargers we put under the framework. I'll stop there. Any questions for me before I move into the, I'll call them technical details of the group? I guess also, and then another, well, I wait to see. And another thing, members, is there anything based off the conversation today that you would like to propose as a question for members to think about as they go over the straw man? I do capture the whole issue of treating chargers differently based off of public and private funding, which is probably something that came out of this presentation, and also separating accuracy versus uptime reliability. All right, I will fix this up and get this circulated today for you all to start working with. It would be nice to have responses before the next meeting. All right, moving into our last topic, the detailed walkthrough of uptime measurements. So for those of you following along at home, members, I have previously shared an Excel workbook with you all. I will be working off the uptime measurement issues tab. So, as most of you are aware, within SB 951, there was a grouping of topics that we were supposed to make recommendations on regarding the adoption and implementation of regulations. And these were a lot of what I would call the nitty-gritty details of how you would implement reliability standards, customer service requirements, and meter accuracy issues across the EVSEs that would be subject to such a framework. And we were told to give deference to NEVI standards in here as well. So what this document does is it outlines what the standard is from NEVI as provided by MDOT, what we, the Public Service Commission, have done with electric utility chargers. So these would be the two frameworks currently in existence under Maryland, one for federally funded charging stations under the NEVI program, and then one for implementation of HB 834 from last year, which most people on this call, I believe, were a part of. And then finally, I asked weights and measures to identify if there is overlap between a standard and what they would be requiring under their meter accuracy rules. So I'm going to have myself and MDOT, so Amanda, kind of talk about what we are doing. And then what I would like to start getting into is issues of what would you all like to prioritize, questions that you have around these, so that when you take this back, effectively what I'm going to ask you all to do over the next week is think about what you think is priority, what you think needs to be overseen, what should be left to the implementing agency, and so forth. So starting with the first one, establish different payment options for retail use of EV supply equipment. So basically, this is the idea that we need to have multiple payment options and make it easier for the customer to pay the EVSE for their services. And so NEVI required multiple methods, and so did the commission, and also it removed the need for membership. So basically, these things had to be able to take payments either via credit cards or over a phone. They also have to have multiple language requirements, and you need to be able to charge your car without being part of some charging network. So I'll stop there for a minute on those. Amanda, anything you want to fill out there from how NDOT implemented this for heavy?
I'll just say that in general, a lot of these requirements we put in our request for proposals and asked for in the proposals that companies state how they plan to comply with these requirements, and that is then put into the contracts that they enter with us at MDOT. So that's how we're planning to impose these requirements.
So when they gave you their RFP, they said, here's how we're going to do it, and that's in their contract with you and them?
Correct.
Sounds good. Members, questions, statements about this, multiple payment options, and or how those thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is Paul. Quick question. Are you getting a range of responses, or is basically everyone pretty well good with what the NEVI requirements are in terms of responses?
I think the
I have
range
received.
that
Oh,
sorry,
go ahead,
I didn't know
Amanda.
who the
Sorry,
question was for.
that
I was
question
just
was for
gonna
you. I
say,
realized as I opened my mouth.
you're good. I was just going to say that, I mean, I think pretty much we have standard responses and companies being able to meet these requirements, with some slight exception to number 4, where it says provide access for users that are limited English proficient accessibility. I think that there are some variations in customer service plan for how they plan to service these users. But in any case, they do list at least some type of option for these customers to be able to access payment, etc., customer service.
Paul, any follow-up?
No, thank you.
And then I guess, Amanda, are you seeing that the information is going to be posted on the charger, and or is it something that customers can learn, or is it simply being able to, I guess, what is labeling requirements? Because I feel like a lot of this might be, I could see apps being predominantly used here.
That's a good question. From what I recall off the top of my head, I know that at the very least the price needs to be displayed from the onset and not have the price change during the charging session. I can't quite remember off the top of my head right now about how much the information about the various payment options, for instance, are displayed on the equipment itself. So I would have to double check that.
Okay, and I guess Allison from Weights and Measures, I know you all require customer needs to be able to know the rate before charging and a number of those things. Do you all discuss how the customer can pay being obvious from the equipment and or through an app?
Not particularly specified like that. The customer has to know what the terms that they're agreeing to are, such as what we would consider the unit display price or the price per kilowatt hour, as well as any other additional charges, such as fees for hooking in, or how much per minute after the customer unhooks, if they're going to continue to get charged after charging is complete. Any of that information would need to be listed up front, but we don't specify exactly how the customer can pay, just as long as they can initiate the transaction and the agreement is properly listed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, they feel pretty similar. I mean, I get that what you're saying is you're not going to say, well, you need to be able to say if the customer can use cash or credit, but I think but in terms of you will have labeling. There needs to be something on the station or some way that the customer can easily learn about the dollar per unit that they're about to pay.
That's correct. Usually that's on the screen when they initiate the transaction. Even if there's like a discount for being a member, it still needs to be displayed, whatever that discount is, whatever the terms that they're agreeing upon the sale. It's a little bit different than a gas station where you pull up the prices are labeled, you know, not only on the sign, but on each unit display price for the grade that they're selecting, as well as any information for, you know, using a specified credit card or a cash transaction or an app. Those are additional discounts. It's a little bit different, but very similar. You would want to know the price per kilowatt hour. And if it's, say, a discount for using a specific app or being a member, then that would need to be clearly noted, whether it is a discount post delivery or prior delivery. All that information would need to be on the recorded representation at the end of the transaction as well.
Okay. And then I guess this question actually might be for Paul. Because I think, like, I remember when well, I guess it's also going to be for the EVSE business community. So I'll start with Paul and then go to the EVSE business community. So for the commission, when we were doing the utilities, one of our important things that came out was we needed to have a contactless payment option, which I think was pretty close to a NEVI requirement in terms of using a phone number to initiate a charge, or a way that the customer didn't have to. Because I think that there's been issues with credit card readers and that kind of stuff. But that was for a utility funded station. If we're going to be discussing uptime for completely private companies, or how strongly, I guess, representing the general use public, I mean, others can weigh in on this too, but I'd be interested to hear from you. How strongly do you feel that we need to regulate that they have a contactless payment option versus just saying the customer needs to be able to make payment at time of transaction?
We talked about this, and the bifurcation that I was looking at was if these are public chargers open to the public, then they do need a contact. If they're totally private, say for a company or a MUD, I think that's a different story. So that's kind of the way I would kind of look at it. And by the way, we keep automatically referring to kilowatt hours. I want to be clear that in Maryland, we're looking at the volumetric use of electricity and not anything else, because people are charging by time. And I frankly don't know what the answer might be for public chargers that might charge for, say, somebody has completed a charge, has left their car there, and are then charged a dwell time charge in order to get them out. I mean, we haven't even attempted to even talk about that one. But I want to make sure that, you know, we are talking about kilowatt hours, and that should be stated boldly right at the start of any discussion. We are not talking about time. We are not talking about other ways of measuring how an EVSE is being used. Thank you.
Welcome. I think Weights and Measures might have put the nail in on that one, because other than supplementary charges, everything sold via these chargers under your rules need to be in kilowatt hour, dollar per kilowatt hour.
Yeah, we keep implying that, but you know, I want to make sure that that's where we're all coming from, that that's the page we're on.
So the correct method of sale would be by kilowatt hour, and that's what MDA would oversee, is transaction by kilowatt hour. That's what we're measuring.
Okay.
Additional fees would be in addition to, for example, a good example would be if you go get your propane cylinder filled up, your 20-pound grill propane cylinder, the proper method of sale that's recognized within the state of Maryland is either by volume or by weight. They cannot charge you by fill. They can't say $20 to fill your 20-pound cylinder because that's the incorrect method of sale, and we do not allow that. It's prohibited within Maryland. However, they can charge an additional fee, $5 to purge your tank or $5 to fill your tanks. They're going to charge additional fees as long as that is clearly and conspicuously stated. So for the correct method of sale or the electricity used at EV chargers is going to be by kilowatt hour. They can conspicuously label time, say after charging, to use that parking space, or a $2 transaction fee at the beginning. They can add that into it in addition to the kilowatt per hour, but the kilowatt per hour would be the correct method of sale.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I just wanted to point that. I think probably just we can in the report we can indicate. You can probably just provide me a summary of what you all are doing, and that can probably just be there for educational purposes. Okay, EVSEs. I did say I was going to give you an opportunity to say something about the whole contact multiple payment options versus just saying you have to provide some form of payment at that point in time. I guess, are you seeing things in other jurisdictions around this based off the presentation? I don't think you are, but any thoughts for the group? Go ahead, Michael. I saw you come off mute. Okay, and then Josh.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. On DC fast charging, it's not really much of an issue because most of them, if not all of them, already take credit cards. I believe that's our impression, at least. With level 2 chargers, they're much less expensive to begin with, and credit card readers are surprisingly expensive, particularly in relation to the cost of the charger itself. And so there could be, it's not unreasonable to expect that if you increase the cost of chargers by requiring a credit card reader, you may end up with fewer chargers deployed across the state, just with the way supply and demand works, right? I'll defer to Blink, ChargePoint, Switch, and others on more details on that, but I wanted to just say that this may be a topic where the work group decides to take a incremental approach on making a hard decision on credit card readers on level 2 chargers. And the primary reason for why it might be prudent to wait is that there are protocols that are on the cusp of becoming widespread, such as ISO 15118, which will enable the vehicle itself to be the credential to the charger, and the vehicle itself will convey the information to the charger that demonstrates that the vehicle has a authorized payment and a credit card or payment account associated with it. It's all still emerging, but it would be unfortunate to implement a regulation that requires the industry to spend a lot of money deploying credit card readers when in 2 years the use of those readers may decline precipitously.
Thank you, Michael. Josh, and then I'll move on.
Thanks. On this issue, I think two kind of framing points are really necessary. One is, like Paul pointed out, what population of chargers are we talking about? And so if we're going to talk about payment standards, to really clearly distinguish between publicly facing chargers versus fleet or multifamily or other stuff, right? And so assuming we're talking about publicly facing chargers, then we should also distinguish between future chargers and existing chargers. And maybe the way to handle this from a process standpoint is to think about what do we want to be the situation going forward, And then we can think as a practical matter, like, okay, what would the actual practical impact be if we go back and then require this retroactively? So maybe that's like a bridge we cross later. But assuming we're talking about publicly facing chargers and chargers that are, prospective, that will be installed, just to use like today as a starting point for this conversation, I do think the NEVI standards provide like a solid framework where they require contactless, they require more than one payment method, they require a toll-free number. So the idea being that even though charging network providers or charge point operators can still receive payment through the apps, et cetera, it still allows basically universal access to anyone with a credit card and or a toll-free number. Michael makes an interesting point. I don't want to like take this conversation off on a tangent. I think assuming this work group is to make recommendations, like looking ahead to a 5-year horizon, say, personally, and Michael, I'd be happy to talk through this more with you and get your thoughts, but I feel like it'll be a while before the industry overall, meaning that particularly the chargers and the autos, are all equipped to support that. And so just like as a rough rule of thumb, I feel like for the next 5 years, it's probably safe to say, let's focus on getting the chargers, how they can accept some form of payment through credit card or toll-free number. And the toll-free number or SMS would be credit card, right? Like it's all about using the credit card as opposed to the app as the form of payment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right. And then there is, before I ask about this, established requirements for transparent information, charging rates, location, accessibility. Enable you, there is a discussion, there's a couple places where issues of subscription come up in this bill. I guess my question for members is obviously we need, if there's a publicly facing station, we probably shouldn't restrict access to it. We could possibly discuss maybe for non-residential purposes, so I guess big commercial stations, maybe that there's such an allowance, but we're going to assume the generic ones. And I guess my question is, do we, other than stating that, so you can have a subscription membership model, but you have to still allow anyone to access the station. Is there any, I guess, issues going that way as a possible consideration or straw man? All right, and then charging companies, I assume I'll hear from you if you have concerns with that. All right. Okay, moving into this, established requirements for transparent information regarding the EV charging station charge, including the rates, the location, accessibility, and real-time availability. So on first glance, this seems like it's something I could do at the station, but really this reads more like there needs to be a way for this to be communicated more than being able to see the station. So I guess, I know we don't have the bill sponsors here today, because my question on this issue was, is this trying to force the charging stations to make their information available online through an app or something for people to know about the location, the accessibility, the real-time availability? Since they're not here, I don't know if there's somebody who might have been involved with the drafting of the bill that could speak to what this is trying to accomplish. And we can start getting thoughts from members. I'll highlight in yellow the provision I'm talking about. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I think that's an issue of concern, and this is from somebody that this actually happened to. They went to use the chargers at BWI Airport, expecting to be able to get full charges in. And in fact, they found out that the utility had ratcheted back the amount of charging that could take place. And if memory serves me right, it was not optional where they could basically go ahead and opt out of it. That's concerning if somebody is moving through the state and is got an app that's showing that EVSE is totally available. That is really concerning. I mean, and we should be able to deal with that somehow.
Okay, I guess. No, it's good. So basically, this is a good way to think about this one is the advertising out through apps of what you are and your availability. Is that probably a good way to think of this requirement?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. And this happened over, as I heard, over the July 4th weekend when a lot of people were traveling.
Right.
So it's a very inopportune time to have something like this occur.
Right. I guess question on this, is that something that kind of solve like I guess for example, like I can look up a gas station online, Google will pull it all up and I can usually find the store hours. They'll usually have a qualifier. This may or may not be accurate. But I'm trying to figure out it. Like I get that there's all these apps out there that can tell customers this, but trying to figure out some of them are crowdsourced, some of them are driven by the site host. So maybe I guess to the extent the site host is managing their own app, maybe that's something we could look at. But for all these crowdsourced apps out there, I have a hard time seeing how I impose this one, if that makes sense, in terms of I get where you're coming from a customer service improvement perspective, but there isn't really as far as I'm aware, a government mandated, I'm not aware of any government mandated apps for this stuff. So I'm trying to figure out how I impose this on a site host or the network.
Maybe that's where you talk about. I know that there's a section here on penalties, where if what is expected to be received energy-wise from either DCFC or a level 2 is not happening and it's reported, then I mean to me that's not a real satisfactory way of dealing with this, because somebody's moving through the state and then winding up with, instead of a half-hour dwell time in order to charge, it's more like an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours. So that's to
Is
me.
that something? No, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask, is that maybe separate from availability? So thinking about it as if you have a DC fast charger, I don't think level 2 really does any throttling, but DC fast charging where maybe there's multiple ports, and that is like you would need some sort of labeling or public like if you're going to allow for throttling at the station, that needs to be advertised. And when I say throttling, I mean because you're engaging in some sort of like demand response program, like the DSM programs, or if multiple ports are in use at a station. I think there's some electronic issues also. It's like, yes, I could get this very fast charge out of it, but that's assuming that there's no other cars sitting at that station not using one of the other ports. So power sharing, would that be more satisfactory from a disclosure standpoint? Or are you thinking real time on an app
I think
versus maybe what I'm thinking is, yeah, go ahead.
I honestly think it's got to be real time. How would you feel if you were taking your car through Maryland and you expected to be at a certain location, after your trip, and it's 2 hours off because you've got to stop somewheres and your EVSE has been throttled back. I mean, it's a real big issue if people don't know about it. And I think it's got to be done in real time. It can't be done after the fact.
All right. Thanks for that. Well, other members, thoughts on this at this time? Questions? All right, going to move on then. Establish employee training or certification requirements for individuals who install and perform maintenance. So I will say for the commission, we aren't putting any sort of certification requirements on individuals, but the utilities have to maintain their station to a set level. I know MDOT, you all have requirements on qualified technicians. So do you want to speak to that, or please speak to that first, and then I'll go to weights and measures.
For federally funded charging stations, they need to be installed by someone who is EVITP certified. And there is language in there that there's possibility for an alternatively approved program, but I think that for Maryland, really, we're moving forward just EVITP.
All right. Do you know how, and maybe this would be a question for Allison, how that aligns with weights and measures rule for qualified service technician?
I don't know that.
You. Okay. Sounds good. Allison, go ahead. We know you have your qualified service technician. How do you know anything about that relative to EVITP?
So I can't speak to MDOT. However, Maryland Department of Agriculture Weights and Measures does register not only agencies, but license the technicians that work for the agencies, ensuring that they have suitable standards and follow specifications, as well as guidelines laid out in NIST Handbook 44. Additionally, they're required to understand and acknowledge Maryland COMAR, involving registered service agencies. So this would also fall under agencies that would be hired to not only install these devices, but repair and place these devices not only into initial service, but return these devices into service after they have been removed for a violation. That is something that I'm looking at possibly starting the beginning of this year. These agencies would not only be required to register with us, but each technician would be required to take the National Conference on Weights and Measures exam for EV chargers and pass it. And if so, they will be registered with us for the duration of the license, which is right now in COMAR, it's once every 2 years. Metering technicians renew 1 year, and the following years it scales. So this year it's actually metering technicians that would renew, and technicians and agencies involved in installing these devices would fall under that side of the program.
Thank you, Allison. Go ahead, Mal. You're going to answer. Maybe you know the answer.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on EVITP, but my understanding is that there's no component of that curriculum that discusses state by state weights and measures regulations and the expectation to install or register as a service agent. So you can have someone who's gone through the training as an electrician, is qualified to install a charging station, but there's been a challenge in making those folks aware that there may be other state requirements for registering to put a device into service per MDA's requirements. So I don't think that connection has really been made for a lot of the electricians doing this kind of work.
Okay. Are you seeing that, knowing that you probably participated in NEVI, are you saying that the EVITP, not knowing about it, are you saying that that's a more common certification out there that, I guess, trying to think about workforce availability to do any of the stuff that we're hoping for here?
Sure. I would say there are certainly other ways for a qualified electrician to go ahead and do the installation. ChargePoint certainly works with those kinds of individuals in other states. For example, manufacturers of devices like ChargePoint might have specific training related to their own equipment that can make someone qualified. Um, so when you're talking about the installation specifically, I think it varies. Um, but EVITP, I would say, is not the only type of program to help make sure folks are qualified. And I'm happy to
All right.
follow up with more information about this.
Yeah, it might be helpful. I see. Okay. Go ahead, Anthony. Olivia, just listen to what Anthony says and let me know if you think we need to weigh in on anything else.
I'll just add from Electrify America's perspective, our experience with EVITP has been that it often takes the program an extremely long time to not just certify individuals, but then once they've completed the program, actually get them their credentials so that we can sort of comfortably bring them on board and say, yes, this person is EVITP certified. We've also seen issues with the EVITP curriculum not updating as quickly as like industry technology is. So we've had, folks go through the EVITP program, but then have to do our own sort of supplemental third-party in-house sort of training. Some of the other sort of certification pathways that like Mal had referenced, having to do that in addition to their having the EVITP certification. So all that's to say, we have been, as Electrify America has been supportive of language that says something to like EVITP or other training certification, because we had some of these challenges with EVITP specifically, and it's just not simply like the be all and end all of training programs.
Got it. Thank you. Olivia, go ahead, but you can keep it under 30 seconds. That'd be great.
I just wanted to make a note to recognize the difference between the types of workforce that are doing installation work and those that are doing maintenance work. So as this conversation continues, to just recognize that it's typically not EVITP or electricians that are doing the maintenance and service work on chargers to maintain reliability. And while there are certifications nationally for maintenance, it's that's only just begun, and there's not something that is widely adopted from the industry on that point. So if you get into a discussion around requirements for maintenance for chargers, we'd be happy to provide more information there. But just recognize it's two different skill sets, two different types of folks in the workforce. And there's, a jungle gym of pathways to become an EVSE service technician.
Got it. Thank you. All right. The next one is minimum power output. Now remember that so there are minimum requirements for DC fast charging under the NEVI funding, but remember, and also for level 2, I would note though that those are to receive funding. For us at the commission, I think we set minimums for DC fast charging related to 250 volts. And this is getting into part of the discussion that me and Paul were having, which is also allowed by NEVI. We allowed for power sharing at the station, so long as the customer consented to accepting lower power levels from the DC fast charging. So the station couldn't just choose the throttle; they had to receive agreement. And then level 2s. we did also allow for that load management. We didn't set any minimum power standards. I know that MDA weights and measures doesn't have it. So that's something we'll all need to think about. We don't need to discuss it in depth now. I think I might have a straw man recommendation of I think I would focus probably more on labeling of the equipment as to what the minimum power output is versus needing to set minimum power outputs. But I will look forward to that discussion with you all probably next time. All right, the next one is just saying who should receive reports, which I think we will get more into as we flesh out the framework, but that's just something to be aware of. Moving on from that, establishing labeling requirements regarding rates, capacity, voltage. That is something that is required already under weights and measures. And also we, the commission, set labeling requirements for how to start the charge, and the phone numbers, and communicating the price structure and fee structure for the utility-owned stations. All seems pretty nuts and bolts there that we can all discuss if we need to do more, anything above what weights and measures is doing. All right, now to the meat of it, to make sure this does get hit on, requiring a 97% uptime. So we as a group will need to reach agreement, or this will probably be a big recommendation for the legislature is, will we require an uptime of 97%, and of who would we make such a requirement? To what Paul was stating, that was one of the main reasons this legislation came into existence. So I think just to make sure you all understand NEVI and the commissions, which are pretty much identical requirements for uptime, which is basically it needs to be working as designed. So the charge, and there's a couple nuances I'm going to hit here. But the commission largely adopted what NEVI was doing, which is basically it needed to be able to charge a car when initiating, whether it was connected to the network or not, and that is an important distinction. When I say report, so I think there's most of you probably know, but a station can, a lot of these are connected to the internet, and therefore there are possibilities where if it's not connected to the internet, a station may not actually allow a customer to start the charge, or it might not record that a charge happened. And so that was a big requirement in terms of NEVI saying, well, no, you need to be able to start the charge regardless of if it's connected to your larger network or not. And if you do have a interruption and it's operating, you need to still be able to bill the customer after the fact. Otherwise, you're dispensing electricity for free. A debate that came up in our work group, and it looks like, actually, it would be good to hear from Amanda what you did with this, but port versus station. And this was, and I should say port, it was port versus connector. And so the commission, we got into a debate about is the uptime, the reliability of the unit going all the way to the individual connectors, so there's a port by which when a car shows up to the station, the car connects to a single port, but a port could have multiple connectors on it. So it could be that the port is working and dispensing electricity through one of the connectors, which could be something like CHAdeMO versus the Tesla North America standard. I'm sure there's one more I'm missing right now. And if one of those connectors is broken, then it could you could argue that it wasn't working or not working. The commission is measuring that port, but because of how the utilities work their systems and to measure reliability, it was just determined that we were going to do all of our enforcement down to the connector level. I think Amanda, MDOT, because NEVI says port, you are not going for reliability all the way down to the connector. You're only going down to the port itself.
That's correct.
Got it. And when I say port, that means still at least one of the connectors has to work, just not all the connectors. Because if none of the connectors work, then to me the port's effectively useless.
Yes, that's correct as well.
Okay. So that's just a lot to take in. Any questions about the 97% uptime? And if members would like a more detailed walkthrough of that from me or Amanda, we can do that at either offline or at the next meeting. But we'll need to determine if we would, which of these we would adopt, and who it would apply to is probably going to be the biggest, I would say, discussion. There's also things related to the screens working and not working. All right, customer support requirements. So once again, we're now back to customer support. We have the labor, basically this is how customers can get a hold of the owner or network if there are issues, and to get customer service out there, we are requiring our utilities to have something. And I believe NEVI is doing the same. Amanda, was there any details, like I guess important details that you all required via your contracts, or is it kind of unique to each charging station?
It's the latter for us. We sort of took
Okay.
what they proposed and used that to evaluate whether we wanted to move forward with the contract or not.
Okay. And similar to other discussions, it will be important to probably distinguish DC fast charging level 2. Well, I don't know if you need, but private versus public facing, and thinking about how this might change depending on who I'm working with. And then I would also, I think a good discussion should probably remain around, would we legislate minimum hours of operation versus saying you need to you need to advertise appropriately when it is available. And then also dispatching customer assistance. There's also a requirement, go ahead. Oh, okay. There's also a requirement for proactive monitoring of EVSE and EV charging stations. That's something that I don't think any of us have really flushed out before. So I would welcome any feedback you all have on what you think that means, and or if that's something that would be more left up for the implementing agency. Does say we need to discuss standards and procedures for basically Handbook 44. We've heard a lot from MDA on that. I guess what would probably be good to hear from you all is there are things that you think we need to discuss from Handbook 44 in this group versus allowing them to go forward with what is already there. And then as we reach the end of our time, the last couple things are the discussing the standards of use for the different connectors out there. This is the CCS, the combined charging station standard. There's CHAdeMO, which is an older charging connector standard. And then there's also the North America charging standard, which a number of companies recently, within the last year or two, announced they were switching to. This is Tesla's model for charging. And so NEVI actually specified what kind of connector type should be used. The commission did not state what types of connectors should be used. It just simply said if you have a connector at the station, it needs to be working. And well, we would measure uptime regardless of the connector type. And so that we'll need to decide if we're going to have any rules special to these two. I think it would be more prudent to get away from the technology type and just focus on being technology agnostic in that regard. And then finally, this gets into our enforcement section, which is civil penalties. We will have that discussion. The commission has finding authority for utility-owned stations. We know weights and measures is using a combination of condemning stations and or fines, depending on the severity of the problem. And that is most of it. Any questions for me? So what I will ask for before the next meeting is feedback from you all with basically on each of these line items, your thoughts about how or if we should implement a standard for it. Is there, would you do a breakdown in terms of it being applicable to some charging stations versus not all charging stations? Also, is this something that you think that we need to legislate versus this something where you would say leave it to the implementing agency to determine in terms of specificity? Also recognizing that we do only have really a month and a half, probably a month and a half, really a month and a half to kind of work through all this. So if there's certain things that you think are more important than others, please give me that feedback as well. And then finally, during the next week, 2 weeks, I will make myself available to hop on any phone call to discuss these issues with you, to make sure you understand how we, the commission, have implemented it, issues we worked through, since a number of these topics came up in our previous work group. So questions on this? All right, we are 3 minutes left. Are there any public comments or questions? All right. With that, our next meeting will be Monday. Oh, sorry, will be Tuesday, September 3rd, from 1 to 3 p.m. I think we got through enough material today that we don't need to extend just yet to a longer meeting. But if any members think you need more time at a meeting to discuss issues, please let me know. Also, if there's certain things that you want to see dealt with in the next meeting, please let me know. What we will be working through is the revised draft answers that you have for the revised draft framework, and also your thoughts on what I just walked through, and answering questions there and starting to make decisions. All right, if you have anything in the interim, please let me know. Otherwise, everyone have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks. Have a nice holiday.
Thank you.
Have a good day.